On an unusually still night in the summer of 1823, the air above the marshlands of South Carolina felt heavy, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. The Carter Plantation had survived hurricanes, crop failures, and whispers of rebellion that drifted through the slave quarters like restless spirits. But no one on that property could have imagined how quickly its illusion of order would collapse. Just after midnight, while cicadas sang in the dark and the moon hung low over the cotton fields, a glow appeared near the tobacco barn. Within minutes, another blaze erupted beside the carriage house. Before the plantation bell could ring, a third fire clawed its way up the wooden walls of the main storage shed. 3 separate fires, all at once. Overseers stumbled from their beds in confusion, shouting commands that tangled in the smoke. Enslaved families were dragged from their cabins and forced into the yard, their faces illuminated by the violent orange light. The flames spread with unnatural speed, as though they had been waiting for permission. Sparks leapt across dry grass, and the scent of burning timber mixed with the sharp bitterness of fear. Master William Carter stood on the veranda in his nightclothes, unable to comprehend how disaster had struck 3 corners of his estate at the same time. He demanded answers from men who had none. Rumors began forming before the first bucket of water was thrown. Some swore they had seen shadows moving between the buildings moments before the fires began. Others insisted it was an accident, a lantern knocked over by careless hands. Yet even the most loyal overseer could not ignore the terrifying symmetry of the destruction. Fire did not behave like this by chance. Among the enslaved stood a young man named Isaiah, his wrists raw from a day spent hauling timber beneath the brutal sun. He watched the chaos with eyes that revealed nothing, though inside his mind raced with thoughts he dared not speak. For months, quiet conversations had drifted through the quarters after dark, carried in murmurs too soft for white ears to catch. Whispers about freedom, about risk, about sacrifice. The flames now licking the plantation buildings seemed almost like a signal, but Isaiah could not tell whether it was salvation arriving or doom tightening its grip. As dawn approached, the fires were finally subdued, leaving behind charred beams and a plantation shaken to its core. Carter gathered his overseers and made a promise that sent a chill through everyone who heard it. He would find whoever was responsible, and when he did, punishment would be swift and unforgettable. What no one realized in that smoke-filled morning was that the fires were only the beginning, and the true plan had not yet revealed itself. If you're drawn to stories that uncover the hidden darkness of history, make sure you subscribe to Canon of Darkness, because what happened after the flames died would change Carolina forever. And before the sun fully rose over the ruins, a discovery in the ashes would prove the fire was never meant to destroy the plantation alone. By sunrise, the Carter Plantation looked less like a working estate and more like the aftermath of a battlefield. Smoke lingered in gray ribbons above the ruins, drifting slowly across fields that had once symbolized order and control. The tobacco barn was reduced to a skeletal frame, the carriage house collapsed inward like a crushed rib cage, and the storage shed stood blackened and hollow. Master William Carter moved through the wreckage with a rigid jaw, refusing to accept that this devastation could have unfolded without deliberate intent. The first unsettling detail emerged when one of the overseers, Thomas Grady, sifted through the debris near the carriage house and found remnants of oil-soaked cloth tucked beneath a fallen beam. It had not been part of the structure. It had been placed there.
Similar scraps appeared near the barn's foundation and beside the shed's outer wall. The placement was too precise to dismiss as coincidence.
Whoever ignited the fires had understood how wind moved across the property and how dry timber would carry flame from one building to the next. Carter's expression hardened as the evidence mounted. He had spent years convincing himself that his plantation operated under firm discipline, that fear alone was enough to secure loyalty. Yet the calculated nature of the arson suggested planning, cooperation, and courage. It implied organization among people he considered incapable of such coordination. That realization disturbed him more than the loss of buildings. In the slave quarters, anxiety deepened as word spread about the cloth fragments. The enslaved men and women knew what would follow. Punishment would not be selective. Suspicion would fall broadly, and innocence would offer no protection. Isaiah stood among them, outwardly calm, though his pulse quickened when he learned what had been discovered. He understood that the fires were never meant to destroy property for its own sake. They were meant to test something, to measure how quickly the plantation would fracture under pressure. Later that afternoon, Carter assembled everyone in the main yard. His voice carried across the crowd as he announced that no one would leave the property until the guilty were found. Patrols would double, night watches would tighten, food rations would be reduced if cooperation did not improve. He framed it as justice, but the tremor beneath his words betrayed something closer to fear. That evening, as shadows lengthened across the scarred earth, Isaiah noticed something else near the remains of the storage shed. Carved faintly into a surviving wooden post was a small mark, almost invisible unless one knew to look for it. It was not random. It was a symbol passed quietly between a handful of trusted souls over the past months, a sign that meant readiness. The plantation believed the worst had already happened. The master believed control could be restored through intimidation. Neither understood that the 3 fires had not been the act itself, but only a message.
And as darkness settled once again over Carolina, Isaiah realized the next step of the plan would demand more than courage. It would demand sacrifice. Before another week passed, someone within the plantation would vanish without a trace, and the disappearance would expose a truth far more dangerous than fire. The days following the fire unfolded beneath a blanket of suspicion that pressed down on everyone at the Carter plantation. Patrols marched the perimeter from dusk until dawn, their lanterns swinging through the darkness like restless eyes. Overseers searched cabins without warning, overturning straw mattresses and prying up loose floorboards as though rebellion might be hiding beneath splintered wood. Master William Carter watched it all with a tightening sense of urgency, convinced that force would smoke out whoever dared challenge his authority. Isaiah felt the tension in every exchanged glance. Conversations in the quarters grew shorter, guarded, though beneath that caution ran a current of resolve that could not be extinguished by threats. The small carved symbol near the storage shed had not been an accident. It had been a promise that the fire was only the first signal, and that others were ready to act when the moment demanded it. 3 nights after the blaze, something happened that shattered the fragile rhythm of control Carter believed he was restoring. Isaiah Turner, one of the strongest field hands and a man known for keeping his head down, failed to appear for roll call at sunrise. At first, the overseers assumed he had overslept, but when his cabin was found empty and undisturbed, unease rippled through the yard. There were no signs of struggle, no broken door, no scattered belongings. It was as though he had dissolved into the humid Carolina air. Carter's temper flared into open fury. He ordered an immediate search of the surrounding woods, sending mounted patrols along the riverbanks and into the marsh. Dogs were brought in, their handlers confident that no man could outrun trained hounds. Yet the animals circled aimlessly near the edge of the property, confused by a trail that seemed to vanish without direction. The implication unsettled even the most hardened overseer. Elijah had not fled blindly. He had left with purpose, or with help. In the quarters, whispers returned with sharper urgency. Isaiah kept his composure, though inside his thoughts churned. Elijah had been present during several of the quiet nighttime discussions that followed prayer meetings, when talk of resistance was disguised as scripture. He had listened more than he spoke, but when he did offer words, they carried weight. If Elijah had disappeared willingly, it meant the plan had advanced further than anyone outside their circle suspected. That evening, Carter addressed the assembled workers again, declaring that Elijah would be found and made an example of. He insisted that someone among them knew the truth and warned that silence would be punished as severely as guilt. His threats echoed across the yard, yet beneath his authority lay the thirst crack of uncertainty. He no longer understood the boundaries of his own plantation. As darkness settled once more over the scarred fields, Isaiah stared toward the distant tree line where the woods swallowed the horizon. He knew Elijah's disappearance was not an act of desperation. It was a movement. It was a strategy. And it meant the fires had accomplished exactly what they were meant to do. Before the next moon reached its peak, a letter would surface that proved Elijah had not only escaped, but had allies far beyond the Carter plantation, and that revelation would ignite something far more dangerous than flames. The search for Elijah stretched into its fourth day, and with each passing hour, Master William Carter's confidence thinned beneath the weight of unanswered questions. Patrols returned from the swamps soaked and empty-handed. The dogs, once so certain, now whined at the edge of the tree line as if they sensed something beyond their training.
Carter refused to accept that a man he considered property could simply disappear without assistance, which meant the threat was no longer confined to one missing field hand. It was woven into the plantation itself. The discovery came from an unlikely place. Late that afternoon, as workers were forced back into the fields under double supervision, a bale of cotton was being prepared for transport to Charleston. When one of the overseers drove his metal hook into the packed fibers, he struck something firmer than compressed cotton. Irritated, he tore the bale open, expecting contraband or stolen tools. Instead, a folded sheet of paper slipped free and fell into the dirt. Paper was rare in the quarters. Writing was rarer still. The overseer retrieved it, suspicious before he even unfolded it. What he found made his face drain of color. The note was not long, but it was deliberate. It spoke of a meeting place beyond the marsh, of safe passage arranged through allies who believed that no man should be owned by another. It referred to the fires as a signal, a test of resolve that had succeeded. At the bottom of the page was a mark identical to the one carved into the charred wooden post near the storage shed. The letter was signed with a single initial, E. Carter read the message twice, his hands trembling despite his effort to appear composed. The existence of the letter confirmed his deepest fear. Elijah had not fled in isolation. He had been part of a coordinated effort that extended beyond the boundaries of the plantation. The fires were not random sabotage, they were communicating. The implication that free allies operated nearby, perhaps in Charleston or along the waterways, threatened everything Carter believed he controlled. He gathered the overseers in private and ordered silence about the letter's contents. Panic among the enslaved would only embolden them, he argued, though in truth he feared panic among his own men even more. If outside networks were involved, then the plantation was no longer a closed world. It was exposed.
In the quarters, Isaiah sensed the shift before anyone spoke of it. The patrols grew harsher. Rations were cut again. Eyes lingered longer on certain faces. Yet beneath the strain, hope stirred quietly. Elijah's disappearance had not ended in capture. It had progressed into connection. The letter, even unseen, would eventually become known, because secrets never stayed buried in soil already turned by suspicion. That night, as thunder rolled faintly in the distance, Isaiah understood that the next move would determine everything. If the network beyond the marsh was real, then more would attempt the journey. If it failed, retaliation would be merciless. Within days, someone trusted by Carter himself would reveal that the conspiracy reached closer to the main house than anyone dared imagine. The tension on the Carter plantation no longer simmered beneath the surface. It pulsed openly through every command and every watchful glance. Master William Carter tightened his grip on daily operations, convinced that visible strength would suffocate rebellion before it fully formed. What he failed to recognize was that fear, once overused, loses its power and begins to reveal weakness instead. The discovery of Elijah's letter had unsettled him more than he allowed anyone to see, and that unease made him careless in ways he did not yet understand. Thomas Grady, the senior overseer, had served Carter for nearly a decade. He prided himself on discipline and loyalty, believing that order could be preserved through rigid enforcement. Yet since the fires, Grady had grown unusually quiet. He studied the workers with an intensity that felt different from suspicion. It felt almost like calculation. Carter noticed the shift but dismissed it as exhaustion, assuming his most trusted man was simply overwhelmed by the search. One evening, as Carter reviewed shipment records in his study, Grady requested a private audience. The request alone was unusual. Overseers rarely sought closed-door conversations unless reporting theft or insubordination. When Grady entered, his expression carried a weight that unsettled even Carter's hardened composure.
Grady explained that the fires and Elijah's disappearance were not isolated incidents. He claimed to have overheard fragments of conversation weeks before the blaze, subtle references to timing and signals that he had ignored at the time. He admitted that he believed the conspiracy extended beyond the quarters and into areas Carter would find uncomfortable to consider. When Carter demanded clarity, Grady hesitated before revealing what he had discovered during a routine inspection of the carriage house, days before the fire. He had seen a lantern placed deliberately near stacked oil barrels, positioned in a way that could only serve one purpose. He had also noticed that someone with access to the main storage keys had left them unsecured the night before the blaze. Only a handful of individuals possessed that level of access. One of them worked inside the main house. Carter's jaw tightened as realization dawned. The possibility that someone within his domestic staff, someone who moved freely between the house and the yard, could be part of the network, threatened his sense of superiority more than any missing field hand. It suggested intelligence and coordination far closer to him than he could tolerate. What Carter did not know was that Grady's motives were not entirely rooted in loyalty. Over the past year, Grady had accumulated gambling debts in Charleston, debts that left him vulnerable. A contact in the city had approached him months earlier with questions about plantation security, offering discreet payment for small pieces of information. At the time, Grady had rationalized it as harmless. Now the consequences were unfolding faster than he anticipated. As night fell, Carter ordered quiet surveillance of every worker who entered the main house, unaware that Grady himself had become a silent bridge between two worlds. The plantation believed it was tightening control, yet the conspiracy had already threaded itself into its very foundation. Before Carter uncovered the name inside his own household, a second signal would be sent, and this time the flames would not be the warning. The Carter plantation braced for another fire, yet when the second signal came, it arrived without flame or smoke. It arrived in silence, carried not by destruction, but by sound.
On a humid evening, thick with the scent of river mud and crushed cotton leaves, a church bell rang from across the marsh long after any service should have ended. The distant chapel belonged to a modest white congregation miles away, and its bell had never been heard at that hour. It rang once, paused, then rang twice more in deliberate rhythm before falling quiet again. Most on the plantation dismissed it as coincidence. Master William Carter did not. He stood on the veranda, listening to the echo fade across the darkened fields, sensing intention in its cadence. The pattern unsettled him because it mirrored something he had once heard from a traveling merchant about coded signals used along coastal trade routes. Sound could travel where written messages could not. The sound left no ash behind. In the quarters, Isaiah felt the shift immediately. He had been waiting for that pattern. Weeks earlier, during one of the guarded nighttime conversations disguised as prayer, an older woman named Ruth had described how certain churches, sympathetic to abolitionist sentiment, communicated without words. Bells could signal safe passage. Lanterns placed in specific windows could confirm readiness. The fire had tested resolve within the plantation. The bell confirmed that allies beyond the marsh were prepared. Thomas Grady heard the bell as well, and unlike the others, he understood its implications. His contact in Charleston had once mentioned that support networks were expanding inland, relying on trusted clergy and free black dock workers to move men discreetly along the waterways. Grady realized that Elijah's escape had likely reached that network successfully. The fires had not merely drawn attention, they had proven commitment. Carter, meanwhile, intensified surveillance inside the main house. He ordered that every domestic worker be questioned separately. Silverware was counted, keys were reassigned, movements were restricted. The illusion of calm he projected masked a growing recognition that control was slipping through his grasp in ways brute force could not reverse. Late that night, Isaiah noticed a faint glow flicker 3 times in the upper window of the distant chapel across the marsh. It was not lightning. It was not an accident. It was confirmation. The path was open.
Yet the plan required more than opportunity. It required trust, timing, and sacrifice from someone who could move freely enough to pass unnoticed. Isaiah understood what that meant. The next phase would demand action from within the very walls Carter believed were secure. By the following Sunday, a member of the Carter household would vanish during daylight hours, and the disappearance would expose a betrayal no one saw coming. Sunday arrived beneath a sky so clear it felt almost cruel. The plantation followed its customary routine of forced worship, with enslaved families gathered under supervision while a visiting preacher spoke of obedience and divine order. Master William Carter sat in the front row, satisfied by the display of structure, believing that ritual reinforced hierarchy. He did not notice how often certain eyes drifted toward the distant marsh beyond the tree line. Among the domestic staff was Sarah Whitmore, a young woman assigned to the main house whose presence had long been considered harmless. She moved quietly through hallways, carrying trays and linens, rarely meeting Carter's gaze directly. Her position allowed her access to keys, schedules, and overheard conversations. It also allowed her to observe patterns others ignored. For months, she had listened more than she spoke, memorizing which doors remained unlocked during services and which paths were least guarded during midday heat. When the preacher's voice rose in a prolonged prayer, the congregation bowed their heads. Overseers relaxed slightly, lulled by routine.
In that narrow window of distraction, Sarah slipped away from the edge of the gathering under the pretense of retrieving water for the house. Her absence was subtle at first. No one counted domestic workers the way they counted field hands. She moved through the kitchen yard, crossed behind the smokehouse, and entered the narrow corridor between stacked lumber and the carriage shed, where sightlines from the main house were obstructed. Isaiah, positioned near the back of the assembly, recognized the timing immediately. He kept his posture steady, resisting the urge to look toward the woods. The signal from the chapel had not been symbolic, it had been preparatory. Sunday provided cover that night could not. Minutes passed before Carter's wife requested Sarah's assistance. A housemaid hurried to locate her and returned pale, explaining that Sarah had not come back from the well.
Carter's composure fractured in public view for the first time. He ordered an immediate search, interrupting the service and sending men in multiple directions. Horses were mounted, dogs were summoned again. Yet there were no signs of struggle near the well, no discarded belongings, no footprints distinct enough to follow. The realization struck Carter with humiliating clarity. A member of his own household had vanished in public view, under his direct supervision. The conspiracy he feared had not merely reached the main house, it had operated within it. By late afternoon, patrols reported faint tracks near the marsh that appeared deliberately obscured, as though someone knowledgeable had brushed them away with bundled reeds. The method suggested guidance from someone familiar with escape routes beyond plantation boundaries. As evening shadows lengthened, Isaiah understood that Sarah's disappearance was not reckless defiance, it was coordination. It meant the external network had successfully drawn someone from the very heart of Carter's domain without confrontation. The plantation's illusion of invulnerability had been pierced. Within 48 hours, Carter would uncover evidence that Thomas Grady had known more than he admitted, and that discovery would ignite a confrontation capable of tearing the plantation apart from within. Sarah's disappearance transformed suspicion into something sharper and far more dangerous. Master William Carter no longer viewed the events as scattered acts of defiance. He saw design. He saw coordination. Most of all, he saw humiliation. A woman who moved through his own halls had vanished without confrontation, without visible resistance, and without leaving behind the kind of chaos he understood. The absence of violence unsettled him more than blood would have. Carter began retracing every step taken in the days before the fires, replaying conversations and examining details he had previously dismissed. He reviewed inventory logs from the storage shed and noticed that one oil barrel had been listed as partially drained a week before the blaze, yet no explanation accompanied the entry.
The handwriting beside that notation belonged to Thomas Grady. When Carter summoned Grady to his study, the air inside the room felt heavy despite the open windows. Carter did not accuse him immediately. Instead, he asked about routine matters, observing the overseer's posture and listening for strain in his voice. Grady maintained composure, though his answers carried a hesitation that had not been present in earlier months. Carter's suspicion sharpened when he mentioned the missing oil and saw a flicker of recognition flash across Grady's face before it disappeared. Pressed further, Grady insisted that the oil had been used for routine maintenance, though he failed to specify which structure required it. Carter then revealed that he had found correspondence tucked behind a ledger in the supply room earlier that morning. The paper bore no signature, but it referenced payment schedules and requested updated information about patrol routes after the fires.
The language suggested familiarity with plantation operations at a level only an overseer could provide. Grady's silence became confirmation. Carter felt betrayal cut deeper than fear. He had trusted Grady with authority over others, believing loyalty could be secured through status and privilege. Now he understood that desperation could fracture allegiance faster than ideology. Grady's gambling debts in Charleston had made him vulnerable, and vulnerability had made him useful to a network far beyond Carter's reach. The confrontation did not explode into violence. It settled into something colder. Carter ordered Grady confined under guard while he determined the extent of his involvement. Yet the damage was already done. If Grady had supplied information, then the fires, Elijah's escape, and Sarah's disappearance were not isolated victories. They were stages of a strategy informed by insider knowledge. In the quarters, Isaiah sensed the shift in atmosphere before word traveled openly. Overseers moved with tighter formations. Conversations in the yard were hushed. Something had broken at the top of the hierarchy, and fractures at that level always spread downward. As night descended, Carter realized that punishing Grady would not erase the network's momentum. The plantation was no longer defending against isolated acts of rebellion. It was contending with a system designed to dismantle it piece by piece.
Before Carter could decide Grady's fate, a rider from Charleston would arrive with news that the conspiracy had already reached the city's docks, and that revelation would force Carter into a choice that could destroy him completely. The rider arrived just after sunrise, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cool morning air. Dust clung to his boots and coat, marking a journey made without pause. He carried himself with the urgency of a man delivering news that could not wait for comfort. When the plantation gates opened at his approach, overseers exchanged wary glances, already conditioned to expect disruption. Master William Carter received the visitor on the veranda, projecting composure he no longer felt. The man introduced himself as Deputy Marshal Edwin Harper from Charleston and wasted little time with pleasantries. He explained that several individuals matching descriptions from regional plantations had been sighted near the docks 2 nights prior. Among them was a woman resembling Sarah Whitmore. They were not wandering aimlessly. They were meeting with free black laborers known to assist maritime crews moving northbound vessels under cover of legitimate cargo transport. Harper's voice remained measured, but his words carried weight. He informed Carter that whispers of coordinated escapes had begun circulating among port officials. The fires at Carter Plantation were being discussed not as accidents, but as signals tied to a broader network operating between inland estates and coastal routes. The implication was clear. What had begun in Carolina was not contained within it. Carter felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with the morning air. If Charleston authorities publicly connected his plantation to organized resistance, his reputation among neighboring landowners would erode. Investors would question his competence. Rivals would circle. Maintaining control was no longer simply about discipline. It was about survival within a fragile social hierarchy. Deputy Harper requested cooperation, hinting that silence could be interpreted as complicity. He suggested that Carter provide detailed records of domestic staff, field hands, and overseer assignments over the past 6 months. The request struck Carter as both invasive and necessary. Refusal could isolate him politically. Compliance could expose weaknesses he preferred to remain hidden.
Meanwhile, in the quarters, Isaiah listened as fragments of news filtered through laborers returning from the main yard. Charleston had noticed.
The docks were involved. The network was not a rumor, it was structured. Elijah's disappearance had not ended in capture. Sarah had likely reached safe passage. The chapel bells, the hidden letter, the oil-soaked cloth, all of it connected to something larger than any single plantation. Thomas Grady remained confined under guard, yet his earlier disclosures now carried greater significance. If he had supplied patrol routes, then Charleston operatives had navigated with precision. Carter understood that punishing Grady might satisfy pride, but would not dismantle the machinery already in motion. As Harper departed with promises to return for records, Carter faced a choice that unsettled him deeply. He could escalate violence within the plantation to reassert dominance, risking further rebellion, or he could cooperate quietly with Charleston authorities and hope to contain the narrative. Before Carter made his decision, a coded message hidden in plain sight would surface inside his own home, proving that the final stage of the plan had already begun. Deputy Harper's departure left the Carter plantation suspended in uneasy stillness. Master William Carter retreated into the main house with a mind divided between fury and calculation. Cooperation with Charleston authorities would require transparency he despised, yet defiance could isolate him from allies whose support he might soon need. He convinced himself that control could still be restored if he acted decisively enough. The coded message revealed itself in the least dramatic way possible. Late that afternoon, as Carter's wife sorted correspondence in the sitting room, she paused over a decorative sampler stitched by Sarah Whitmore months earlier. It had hung near the staircase unnoticed, a simple piece of embroidery displaying a biblical verse about deliverance. The fabric had always appeared harmless, a gesture of obedience from a domestic worker grateful for instruction in needlework. Now, with tension sharpening perception, Carter's wife noticed irregular spacing in certain letters of the stitched verse. The capitals did not align evenly. Some threads were darker, almost imperceptibly so, forming a faint pattern when viewed from a distance.
She called for her husband, more irritated by aesthetic inconsistency than suspicious of conspiracy. Carter studied the sampler beneath angled light from the window. As his eyes adjusted, the uneven stitches began to reveal alignment. When he traced the darker threads in sequence, they formed a secondary message embedded within the scripture. The words were subtle but unmistakable. Third Sunday, River Bend, before dawn. The realization struck him with humiliating clarity. The plan had been concealed in his own hallway, hanging where he passed daily without suspicion. The embroidery was not devoted, it was communication. The timing corresponded precisely with Sarah's disappearance and the chapel's bell signal. The river bend referenced a stretch of marshland known for concealed boat access during high tide. Carter felt anger mingled with reluctant admiration. The network's ingenuity lay not in overt defiance, but in patience and placement. Fires had drawn attention, letters had confirmed coordination. Now the message proved that the next movement would occur soon, and it would occur with or without his awareness. He ordered immediate surveillance along the river bend, instructing trusted men to remain concealed rather than confrontational. He intended to intercept the operation quietly, capture participants, and present their failure as proof of his regained authority. Yet doubt lingered beneath his strategy. If he acted too visibly, he risked alerting Charleston allies. If he acted too late, the escape would succeed again. In the quarters, Isaiah sensed the approaching threshold. The sampler had served its purpose. The final stage required precision and courage from those remaining. Every delay increased danger, but hesitation could collapse everything already achieved.
As night settled across the plantation, Carter stood by his window staring toward the unseen river bend, convinced he had finally uncovered the conspiracy's core. What he did not yet understand was that the message was only one layer of the design, and the true objective extended beyond a single escape route.
Before dawn on the third Sunday, Carter would realize he had been positioned exactly where the network wanted him, and the plantation's fate would be decided in a way he could never have anticipated. The third Sunday arrived beneath a sky still wrapped in darkness, the air thick with the damp scent of marsh water rising with the tide. Master William Carter had not slept. He positioned himself before dawn along the narrow path that curved toward the river bend, accompanied by 2 armed men he trusted above all others. He believed he had finally anticipated the network's design. The sampler's hidden message had given him timing and location. For the first time since the fires, he felt the advantage tilt back in his direction. The river moved slowly in the half-light, its surface reflecting faint streaks of gray as the horizon prepared for sunrise. Spanish moss swayed in the stillness, masking shapes and distorting distance. Carter instructed his men to remain hidden among low brush, prepared to intercept anyone approaching the concealed docking point. He imagined capturing Isaiah or another conspirator, forcing a confession and restoring the order that had slipped from his grasp. Minutes stretched longer than expected. The marsh seemed to breathe around them, alive with insects and distant birds, yet no footsteps disturbed the path. Carter began to question whether the sampler's message had been a decoy meant to lure him away from the plantation grounds. That doubt unsettled him because it suggested that he was reacting rather than controlling. Just as the first edge of sunlight brushed the horizon, movement appeared across the river rather than along the path. A small flatboat emerged from the mist, guided silently by 2 figures whose silhouettes blended with the fog. Carter's pulse quickened. He signaled his men to prepare, assuming the escape attempt would occur from his side of the bank. Instead, something unexpected unfolded. On the far shore, several figures stepped forward from behind cypress trees. Among them, Carter recognized Elijah's posture and Sarah's outline. They were not fleeing, they were waiting.
Overseers scrambled with buckets and shouted commands, but the flames resisted their efforts. The structure had been prepared to burn efficiently, its interior lined with accelerants in measured placement. Carter dismounted in disbelief, realizing that the timing aligned perfectly with his presence at the river bend. The sampler's hidden message had drawn him away from the plantation at the exact moment his economic foundation was targeted. Isaiah stood among the assembled workers, his expression composed, neither panicked nor triumphant. He had remained behind by design. The objective was never to rescue everyone at once. It was to fracture the plantation's power in stages, to prove that control rested not solely in the hands of one man. Elijah and Sarah had secured the route. The network had established credibility. Now the cotton gin's destruction would weaken Carter financially and symbolically. Deputy Harper's warnings echoed in Carter's thoughts. Charleston was already watching. News of a second calculated fire would travel swiftly through political circles. Investors would question his stability. Other plantation owners would see vulnerability. The economic damage threatened more than pride. It threatened survival within a system built on perception as much as profit. As the flames finally subsided into smoking ruins, Carter understood that brute retaliation would only confirm the narrative spreading beyond his property. Excessive punishment could invite further scrutiny from Charleston authorities, yet restraint would appear as weakness. He stood trapped between image and impulse, forced to confront a reality he had long denied.
The people he enslaved were not passive labor. They were organized, patient, and capable of striking precisely where it hurt most. That evening, as twilight deepened over the smoldering remains of the gin, Isaiah sensed that the plantation had crossed a point of no return. The fires were no longer warnings, they were leveraged. The balance of power had shifted, not completely, but enough to fracture certainty. Within days, Carter would be forced into negotiations he once considered unthinkable, and the outcome would determine whether the plantation survived at all.
The days following the destruction of the cotton gin unfolded beneath a silence heavier than any shouted command. Smoke no longer filled the air, yet the absence of noise carried its own threat. Master William Carter walked the perimeter of the charred structure each morning as though proximity might restore what had been lost. The gin had been the mechanical heart of his operation, transforming raw cotton into profit. Without it, shipments would stall, contracts would fracture, and creditors would begin asking questions he could not easily answer. News traveled quickly along the Carolina coast. Deputy Harper returned sooner than Carter expected, his tone no longer merely investigative, but evaluative. Charleston merchants had already heard of the second fire. Some viewed it as sabotage tied to a growing underground network. Others whispered about instability within Carter's management. Harper did not threaten openly, yet his presence implied oversight. Carter realized that public displays of retaliation would only strengthen the perception that he had lost control. Within the quarters, tension mingled with cautious anticipation. Isaiah understood that economic disruption altered the conversation in ways moral argument never had. The plantation's power rested on productivity. By striking the gin instead of cabins or fields, the network had demonstrated discipline and intent. It was not chaos, it was leverage. Carter began considering options he once would have dismissed. Rebuilding the gin required funds and labor. Labor requires cooperation. Cooperation required a shift in how he governed. The idea unsettled him, yet practical necessity forced reflection. He convened a meeting with Harper and 2 neighboring landowners, framing it as a discussion of regional security. Beneath that surface, Carter sought counsel on how to prevent further losses without provoking additional rebellion. Harper suggested an approach Carter found distasteful but strategically sound. Quiet concessions could stabilize the situation without signaling surrender. Adjustments in work conditions, limited privileges, subtle reductions in visible brutality. Harper framed it not as generosity, but as risk management. If the network thrived on desperation, reducing its fuel might slow its expansion. That evening, Carter gathered overseers and announced changes that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. Night patrols would remain, but rations would return to prior levels. Punishments would require his direct approval rather than immediate enforcement. Skilled workers would receive minor incentives tied to productivity. He presented the measures as calculated efficiency rather than compromise. Isaiah recognized the shift immediately. The fires had not dismantled the plantation, but they had forced negotiation without spoken bargaining. The network's strength lay not only in escape routes, but in altering behavior through targeted disruption. Elijah and Sarah's departures, Grady's betrayal, and the gin's destruction had combined into pressure Carter could not ignore. Yet Isaiah also understood that fragile change could collapse if misinterpreted as weakness. The network would not dissolve simply because concessions appeared. It would adapt. As dusk settled over fields that felt different from weeks before, Carter stood on his veranda staring across land he still legally owned but no longer fully commanded. The plantation had survived, though altered. Whether the transformation would hold remained uncertain. Months later, when a letter arrived from the north bearing Elijah's name, Carter would finally understand that the fires in Carolina had ignited something far beyond his property lines. If you have followed this journey through hidden signals, calculated risk, and shifting power, make sure you subscribe to Canon of Darkness, because the next story will uncover another chapter of history where control met resistance and darkness revealed unexpected strength.